Hey everyone, this story is gonna keep you on the edge of your seat. Made just for you. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below. And if you're ready for the twist, hit that like button, subscribe, and let's get into it. The story begins with the clack of keyboards echoed through the open office, a steady rhythm that barely drowned out the tension hanging in the air. Mark stood in front of the glass-walled conference room, watching as Alex, his new co-worker, spoke with their manager, Rachel. The conversation was casual on the surface, but Mark noticed the way Alex's eyes darted around, an undercurrent of unease in his body language. Mark had always prided himself on picking up on these small signals, patterns no one else seemed to notice. Mark's lips twisted into a tight smile. He had worked hard to secure his place in the company, climbing steadily through the ranks. He'd earned every promotion, every inch of trust from his superiors. And now, Alex, fresh out of college, was waltzing in, taking his seat in meetings, claiming credit for ideas that were his. Mark felt the simmering irritation growing in his chest. He wasn't going to let some rookie come in and overshadow his efforts. He leaned against the wall, folding his arms across his chest. The sound of Rachel's laughter from inside the room made his blood boil. He'd been passed over for this promotion, this very same position, because of some new direction the company was taking. All of a sudden, the higher-ups thought Alex's new perspective was exactly what they needed. The very idea of it made Mark's jaw tighten. The problem was, Alex didn't know the game Mark had been playing for years. He didn't understand the unspoken rules, the sacrifices, the quiet manipulations that Mark had used to get ahead. But that would change. Today, Mark was going to make sure Alex understood exactly who was in charge. Alex had been oblivious to the subtle sabotage Mark had already begun. The misplaced emails, the quiet whispers to HR about Alex's performance, the little mistakes that Mark had ensured would slip through the cracks, each step had been meticulously planned. And yet, Alex's carefree attitude never wavered. He was either incredibly naive, or he simply had no idea what was coming. Rachel walked out of the conference room, and Mark watched her glance in his direction. She paused for a moment, a thoughtful look crossing her face before she continued down the hallway. He could see the tension in her step. She had no idea the game was about to take a dramatic turn. As Mark headed back to his desk, the door to the conference room creaked open again. Alex stepped out, looking slightly disoriented, as if he had just been told something he wasn't prepared for. His eyes locked with Mark's, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. There was something in Alex's gaze, a flicker of realization, but nothing that betrayed fear. Instead, there was a quiet confidence, as though Alex had been playing his own game. Mark's phone buzzed on the desk. He glanced down. It was an email from HR, an invitation to an impromptu meeting with Rachel and the board of directors. He frowned, a knot forming in his stomach. He had no idea what this was about, but the timing felt off. It wasn't a coincidence. Just then, Alex appeared at his desk, leaning casually against the cubicle wall. "Hey, Mark," he said, his tone light but with an underlying seriousness. "I heard you've been keeping things interesting around here." Mark's heart skipped a beat. How much did Alex know? Was this some kind of challenge? A thin smile crept onto Mark's lips. He was used to being the one in control, but today, something about Alex's calm demeanor sent an unsettling chill through him. "Just doing what I can to make sure things run smoothly," Mark replied, his voice steady. Alex's eyes narrowed slightly, studying him. "Funny," he said. "I'm the one who's about to run things around here." Mark's eyebrows shot up, disbelief flashing across his face. Alex straightened up, a slight smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Rachel's meeting with the board is about one thing. Leadership," Alex continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "And guess who the new CEO is?" Mark felt the ground slip from beneath him. His palms started to sweat, his vision narrowing on Alex's calm face. For a moment, the office, the chatter, the hum of computers, it all faded away. The only thing he could hear was his own heartbeat, hammering in his ears. Before he could respond, Alex turned and walked away, leaving Mark frozen at his desk, trying to process what had just happened. In that instant, Mark realized the truth. The game had shifted, and he was no longer in control. Alex wasn't just some rookie. He was the new boss. The very same person Mark had been trying to undermine was the one now holding the power he had fought for years to claim. Mark had underestimated him. And now, as the news spread through the office like wildfire, Mark couldn't help but wonder, what was Alex's next move? The buzz in the office was undeniable. Conversations in hushed tones rippled through the cubicles as employees tried to process the revelation. Alex, the unassuming new guy, was now their CEO. Mark's stomach twisted. He had spent years maneuvering, positioning himself, believing the top spot was within his grasp. And now, here was Alex, fresh, inexperienced, and somehow already pulling the strings. It didn't add up. Mark's thoughts raced. How could this be? There had to be something he missed. Rachel, the board of directors, they couldn't all be fooled, could they? Mark had been in this game too long, understood its rules too well. But this was different. Something was wrong. He couldn't just sit back and accept it. Not after everything he'd done, all the sacrifices he'd made. Mark's fingers drummed nervously on his desk as he stared at the screen, his mind swirling with possibilities. He had to get to the bottom of this, before Alex had the chance to make his move. Suddenly, a notification flashed on his screen. An email from Rachel. His breath caught in his throat. Asterisk urgent. Meeting with Alex, 4 p.m. Bring all relevant reports, asterisk. Mark's jaw clenched. The meeting wasn't just a formality. It was a challenge. He knew Rachel. She was tough, but fair. If she had chosen Alex as CEO, it was because she believed he could take the company to new heights. But did Alex even understand what he was getting into? Did he have the experience, the knowledge to lead such a massive corporation? The elevator doors pinged open, and Alex stepped off. Mark barely glanced up, but Alex's presence was like a weight in the air, pressing down on everything around him. Alex walked past Mark's cubicle, his steps slow and deliberate. He didn't stop, didn't acknowledge Mark at all. But Mark could feel his gaze, like Alex was looking right through him. Mark's pulse quickened. What was Alex playing at? He had to be trying to provoke him, to test his reaction. The tension between them was palpable, an unspoken rivalry that had just reached a boiling point. Mark stood up abruptly, gathering his things. His hands were steady, but his mind was in overdrive. He needed to prepare. He needed to figure out what Alex was really after, and fast. He walked to the break room, hoping to find Rachel or someone else who could shed some light on the situation. But when he entered, it was empty. The room seemed quiet, too quiet. The clatter of dishes, the hum of the coffee machine. It all seemed distant now. Mark's thoughts were consumed with one question. How did Alex get here? A noise behind him startled him. He turned to see Alex standing in the doorway, a glass of water in hand. Alex didn't say anything at first, just studied Mark with that same unreadable expression. You don't belong here, Mark finally said, his voice low, almost a growl. He didn't care if it sounded desperate. He was past caring. You don't know how this works. You think you're just going to waltz in and take over? Alex took a sip of his water, his gaze never leaving Mark's. He was calm, too calm. It only made Mark more unsettled. You don't understand, Mark, Alex said finally, his voice smooth, deliberate. I'm not here to play by the rules. I'm here to change them. The words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. Change the rules? That was the last thing Mark needed right now. The thought of Alex completely turning the company upside down, dismantling everything Mark had worked for, made his stomach churn. I've worked too hard to let you walk in here and destroy everything, Mark said, his fists clenching at his sides. Alex stepped forward, closing the distance between them, his presence like a shadow in the room. Maybe you're the one who's been holding things back, Alex said, his tone a little sharper now. Maybe it's time for a change, Mark. Time for someone who isn't so tied to the past. Mark's mind raced. Was Alex implying that everything he had built, all the work he'd put in, was outdated? Was he about to tear it all down? The thought was enough to drive him to the edge. This is my company, Mark spat, his voice rising. I've earned this. You're just some kid who doesn't know the first thing about running this place. Alex didn't flinch. Maybe I don't need to know the first thing, he said, his voice cold. Maybe I just need to know how to make the right decisions. The tension between them crackled in the air, thick and suffocating. Mark was aware of every breath, every movement, as if the entire office was holding its breath in anticipation of what would happen next. But before Mark could respond, Alex turned and walked out of the room without another word. Mark stood there for a long moment, his chest rising and falling as he tried to make sense of the encounter. His hands trembled slightly, but he quickly shoved the feeling down. He had to keep it together. He couldn't let Alex see him crack. The door to the break room swung open again, this time with Rachel standing in the doorway. Her expression was unreadable, but Mark could see the tension in her posture. "Mark," she said, her voice low. "The board wants to see you. Now." Mark's mind raced. What could the board want with him now? What had Alex told them? Was the company already slipping through his fingers? His heart pounded in his chest as he followed Rachel down the hall. Each step felt heavier, like the weight of the situation was bearing down on him, suffocating him. The meeting was about to begin, and Mark knew. Whatever happened next would change everything. Alex had already taken control, and now it was up to Mark to figure out if there was any way to stop him. Mark's mind raced as he followed Rachel down the sterile hallway toward the boardroom. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the silence, each one a reminder of how far he'd fallen in such a short time. He could already feel the pressure of the meeting bearing down on him, tightening like a noose around his neck. When they reached the boardroom door, Rachel didn't say a word. She simply gestured for him to enter. Mark hesitated for a split second before pushing the door open, and as he stepped inside, he was met with a chilling silence. The board members were all seated, their faces unreadable. Alex was at the head of the table, looking every bit the part of a confident leader, his fingers steepled in front of him. "Mark," Alex said coolly, his voice cutting through the stillness. "Glad you could join us." Mark took his seat across from Alex, his eyes narrowing. The tension in the room was palpable, suffocating. He could feel the weight of the board's collective gaze on him, each one measuring him, judging him. Rachel took her seat at the far end of the table, her expression hard to read. "We're here to discuss the future of this company," Alex continued, his tone casual but laced with an underlying edge. "And frankly, Mark, we need to have an honest conversation about your role in it." Mark's heart skipped a beat. His role. What was Alex insinuating? He'd spent years climbing the ladder, proving himself, and now Alex was questioning his place at the table? "Is there a problem?" Mark asked, keeping his voice steady, though inside he was seething. "Because, as far as I'm concerned, I've been doing my job just fine." Alex smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You've been doing your job, Mark, but you've also been holding the company back. You're too focused on maintaining the status quo. We need someone who can adapt, someone who can innovate, not just someone who's good at following the same old rules." Mark could feel the anger rising in his chest, but he bit it back. He couldn't let Alex see him lose control. Not now. "Adapt?" Mark echoed, trying to keep his tone calm. "You think this company needs a revolution? A complete overhaul?" "I don't think it needs one," Alex said, leaning forward, his voice low but firm. "I know it does." The words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. He could feel the sting of them, a sharp reminder that his days of controlling the company were numbered. If Alex had his way, everything Mark had worked for, the projects, the teams, the culture, would be wiped out in an instant, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "Maybe you should consider stepping aside, Mark," Alex said, his gaze unwavering. "For the good of the company." Mark's fists clenched beneath the table, but he kept his expression neutral. He wasn't about to give Alex the satisfaction of seeing him sweat. He had to think. There had to be a way to fight back, to take control of this situation before it spiraled completely out of his hands. "I'm not stepping aside," Mark said through gritted teeth. "Not for you. Not for anyone." Alex's smile deepened, but there was no warmth in it. "We'll see about that." The boardroom door opened then, and a young assistant entered, her face pale. She walked toward Alex, handing him a piece of paper. "Sir, we just received the financial reports from last quarter," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "There's been a significant drop in revenue." "It's—" "Thank you," Alex interrupted, taking the paper without a second glance. He scanned the report quickly, his eyes flicking over the figures, and then tossed it aside with a casual motion. It's not ideal, but we'll manage. Mark couldn't help but notice the way the board members exchanged nervous glances. They were all watching Alex, waiting for him to take charge. Mark's chest tightened. How many of them were truly on his side? How many had already sided with Alex, ready to let him reshape the company? He wasn't blind to the shifting dynamics around him. The tide was turning, and Mark wasn't sure if he could stop it. "I've made my decision," Alex said, breaking the silence. "We're moving forward with the changes I proposed. Mark, you're going to head a new department. It's clear you have experience, but your vision doesn't align with where this company needs to go. So, we're giving you a smaller role. Something more in line with your skill set." Mark felt his stomach lurch. A smaller role? The company he'd dedicated his life to, now slipping away from him piece by piece. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. What could he say? This wasn't just a demotion. It was a message. You're not in control anymore. Alex stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. "Rachel," he said, "let's discuss next steps." "Mark, I'll have HR send you the details of your new role." As Alex walked out of the room, Mark sat frozen. His mind was reeling, his thoughts a tangled mess of anger, confusion, and disbelief. How had he let this happen? How had he allowed Alex to manipulate his way to the top? He had to act. He couldn't let Alex win. Not like this. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized the odds were stacked against him. The board was already on Alex's side. Rachel was firmly behind him, and Mark's options were running out fast. But one thing was clear. He couldn't walk away quietly. Mark clenched his fists under the table, his jaw tight with determination. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The battle for control had only just begun. Mark sat in the boardroom for a few moments after Alex had left, the silence pressing in on him like a physical weight. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair, the blood rushing in his ears. He could feel his pulse quickening, his heart pounding in his chest, but he fought to keep his composure. There was no time to lose. As the last of the board members filed out of the room, whispering amongst themselves, Mark remained seated. He was still processing Alex's words, each one more cutting than the last. A smaller role. A demotion. A token position star. Everything Mark had built was now hanging by a thread, and he wasn't sure how much longer it would last. His phone buzzed on the table, snapping him out of his daze. It was a message from Rachel. "Come to my office. Now." Mark's stomach churned. He had a pretty good idea of what this was about. She was no longer his ally, not after the way Alex had maneuvered her into this position. She'd been instrumental in setting him up, guiding him toward a fall. He couldn't trust her anymore, but he had to go. He had no other choice. He stood up, his legs shaky as he left the boardroom. The hallway felt like it was closing in on him, each step he took heavier than the last. His mind raced with thoughts of how to fix this, how to turn the tables before it was too late. He couldn't just let Alex take over. He couldn't just fade into obscurity. When he reached Rachel's office, the door was already slightly ajar. He pushed it open and stepped inside, trying to remain calm despite the storm swirling in his head. Rachel was sitting at her desk, her expression unreadable. She didn't look up when he entered. "Rachel," Mark said, his voice steady despite the tension that was gnawing at him. "What's this about?" She finally looked up at him, her eyes sharp but calculating. "Alex made his decision, Mark. It's time for you to accept it." She paused, watching him closely. "You've been given a chance to transition. That's more than most people get when they hit a wall like this." Mark's hands balled into fists at his sides. "You knew this was coming, didn't you? You helped him set this up." Rachel's lips tightened, but she didn't deny it. "It's not personal. It's business." "Business?" Mark's voice rose, the anger breaking through. "This is about power. It's about destroying everything I've worked for. Everything we built together." Her eyes flickered, a brief flicker of guilt crossing her face before she masked it. "Alex is doing what's best for the company. You were always too focused on keeping things as they were. We need someone who's willing to innovate, not just maintain the status quo. Is that what you tell yourself to sleep at night?" Mark snapped. "That this is all about progress? You've stabbed me in the back for your own ambition. You're no different than him. Rachel's gaze hardened. I didn't come here to argue with you, Mark. I'm just here to make sure you leave quietly. That's the way it has to be. You have a choice. Leave gracefully or leave with your dignity shattered. Mark could feel the walls closing in on him. This wasn't just about the company anymore. It was about his identity. His entire career was being ripped from him, and the people he thought he could trust were now his enemies. I won't just walk away, he said through clenched teeth. Not when I've worked so damn hard for everything. I'll fight this. Rachel's eyes narrowed. You're making a mistake, Mark. Alex won. The board's behind him. There's no way you're getting back on top. She stood up and leaned across the desk, her voice lowering. You'll just end up like all the others. A casualty of progress. Mark felt his pulse racing again, the heat of frustration and determination surging through him. This was his breaking point. He wasn't going to let this happen. Not without a fight. As he turned to leave, Rachel's voice called after him. Think carefully, Mark. Your choices now will define what happens next. And once you make the wrong one, there's no going back. He slammed the door behind him, the sound of it echoing down the hallway. For the next few days, Mark kept a low profile. He couldn't afford to make any rash moves, not with everything on the line. But as the days passed, the more he stewed over what had happened in that boardroom, the more his anger turned to something else, something darker. He wasn't going to let Alex run the company into the ground. He wasn't going to let them think they could push him aside so easily. He started reaching out, quietly gathering information about Alex's latest projects, the changes he was implementing, the staff he was bringing in. It was all part of his plan. His counterattack? He wasn't going to take this sitting down. But as the days turned into weeks, Mark noticed something disturbing. Alex's influence seemed to grow stronger by the day. Employees who had once been loyal to Mark now avoided him in the hallways, whispering behind his back. The whispers weren't just about his demotion. They were about something far worse. Mark's reputation was being systematically torn apart, piece by piece. One evening, as he sat alone in his office, a knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He looked up, surprised to see Rachel standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. Mark didn't respond right away. What more could she possibly say? But there was something in her eyes, something he couldn't quite place, that made him hesitate. He nodded slowly. "Come in." As she stepped inside, Mark could sense the shift in the air. The stakes were higher than ever, and he knew this conversation could be the turning point. But which way would it go? Rachel closed the door behind her, the soft click of the latch amplifying the silence between them. She stood there for a moment, her arms crossed, her gaze lingering on the empty chair across from Mark. He watched her carefully, trying to gauge whether this was another attempt to sway him, or if there was something more to it. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter than usual. "I've been talking to some people. About you. About your plans." Mark's brow furrowed. "Plans? What the hell are you talking about?" Rachel sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I know you're trying to fight back, Mark. I know you're gathering intel, figuring out your next move. But what I don't think you understand is that you're not just up against Alex anymore. You're up against the entire board. And once they've made a decision, they don't go back. Not even for you." Mark stood up, the chair scraping noisily against the floor. He was tired of being on the defensive, tired of always playing the victim. He didn't want to hear about how things were done or how the system worked. He wanted to win. He wanted his life back. "Why are you telling me this?" he demanded, stepping closer to her. "Are you trying to make me back down? Trying to get me to give up?" Rachel looked away, her expression momentarily clouded with doubt. But she quickly masked it, the businesslike mask slipping back into place. "I'm telling you because I'm trying to help you, Mark," she said, her voice firm. "You don't have to lose. But you need to get out while you still can. Alex has already made the moves. They've already started positioning themselves to make you irrelevant." Mark's pulse quickened. "You sound just like him," he spat, fury flaring in his chest. "Just like Alex. Always telling me what I can or can't do. What I should or shouldn't fight for." Rachel stepped closer, her voice almost pleading now. It's not like that. I don't want you to lose. But I can't watch you self-destruct. You're on the edge, Mark. And I don't know if you'll survive this. You have no idea the kind of pressure Alex is putting on the board right now. You've been in this fight for too long. You don't see how deep the game has gone. Mark's mind raced. The reality of the situation started to settle in. What she was saying wasn't just about office politics. This wasn't about a simple rivalry or a corporate reshuffle. This was a full-blown takeover, and Mark had walked straight into it. He'd been playing chess while Alex had been playing a whole different game, one with rules Mark didn't even know existed. But even as doubt crept into his mind, a part of him still couldn't give in. He couldn't just walk away. He couldn't let Alex win. Not like this. And what if I don't back down? Mark asked, his voice cold. What if I decide to keep going? Keep fighting? Rachel's eyes darkened. Then you'll be making the biggest mistake of your life, she warned him, her voice tinged with a sense of finality. Because if you keep going down this path, you'll have no one left to turn to. You'll be alone, and your career will be over. For a moment, the weight of her words hung in the air. Mark stared at her, the battle within him raging. He could feel the desperation rising in his chest, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't just let it end like this. Not after everything he'd fought for. Not after everything he'd worked so hard to build. I'll make my own choice, he said firmly. And when I do, I won't have any regrets. Rachel shook her head, a small, almost imperceptible sigh escaping her lips. I hope you're right, Mark. But just know, there's a price to pay for every choice you make. With that, she turned and walked toward the door. But before she could open it, she paused. You should really think about what's coming next, she said quietly, almost as if warning him. It won't just be Alex you'll be up against. Mark stared at her back as she stepped out, the door clicking shut behind her. His hands clenched into fists, nails biting into his palms. He could feel the weight of the choices ahead pressing down on him harder than ever before. But now, more than ever, he knew there was no turning back. Days passed, but nothing felt normal. The air in the office had shifted, the tension so thick it was nearly suffocating. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen. His every move seemed to be under scrutiny, every conversation filled with a hidden agenda. Even when he walked down the hall, he could feel the eyes of the employees on him, whispers falling silent as he passed by. The room he once commanded was now slipping away from his grasp. Then came the email. Subject, urgent, immediate changes to your role. It was from Alex, but it wasn't just a simple notification about a change. No, this email carried something far more serious. Mark's hands trembled as he clicked open the message. The first line hit him like a punch to the gut. Asterisk, as of today, you will no longer have any direct authority within the company. We are reassigning your responsibilities and restructuring your role to more of an advisory capacity. Asterisk. Mark's eyes skimmed the rest of the email, each line more damning than the last. This wasn't just a demotion. It was a public declaration that his position, his entire career, was being gutted. He slammed the laptop shut, feeling the anger surge through him again. This was it. The final blow. Alex had officially pushed him out. But there was still one thing left. Mark had no intention of quietly accepting this fate. He wouldn't go down without a fight. Not now. Not when he had everything to lose. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't thought about in a long time. A contact. A former ally. Someone who could help him make one last stand. This fight wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. As Mark paced his office, his mind racing with possibilities, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling faster than he could control. He had no choice but to act now, to take drastic measures. But even as the tension built to a boiling point, Mark knew that each move would be crucial, and the consequences would echo far beyond this office. Mark could feel the tension building inside him, a pressure that gnawed at his insides with every passing second. The walls of his office seemed to close in as his phone buzzed incessantly with updates. Every notification a reminder that his time was running out. This wasn't just a corporate battle anymore. It was a war for his life, his career, his future. He stared at the screen of his phone, where the meeting invite had just popped up, a meeting called by Alex, with all the senior executives on the line. Mark's heart pounded. He knew what was coming. This wasn't a routine meeting. It was a declaration, a final attempt to remove him from the equation, to strip him of everything he had worked for. But Mark wasn't going down without a fight. Taking a deep breath, he stood up and straightened his tie. His palms were sweating, but he wiped them on his trousers, ignoring the uneasy feeling in his chest. He had come too far to back out now. He had to take control, or he would lose everything. As he walked toward the conference room, the weight of the decision hung heavy on him. Each step felt like he was walking closer to a confrontation that would either make or break him. He couldn't be weak. He couldn't hesitate. He entered the room and took a seat at the long table, feeling the eyes of everyone on him. Alex was already seated, his posture relaxed, as if this meeting was just another routine business discussion. But Mark could see the smirk on his face, the confidence that Mark would back down. "Good morning, everyone," Alex said, his voice smooth, almost patronizing. "We're here today to finalize the restructuring of our leadership team. As you all know, some tough decisions have been made, and we're here to put the finishing touches on our next phase." Mark's fingers tightened around the armrest, the words stabbing into him like a knife. He couldn't let Alex do this. Not now. Not when he was this close to winning. "Mark, I trust you've had time to reflect on the changes we discussed," Alex continued, his eyes glinting with something that almost resembled satisfaction. "I think you'll find that the direction we're taking will be beneficial for everyone involved." Mark's jaw clenched. The insinuation was clear. Alex had already decided that Mark would be irrelevant in this new structure. The quiet whispers among the board members, the silent judgment in their eyes. It was all too clear. This was his final moment to prove that he wouldn't let Alex win. He stood abruptly, silencing the room with his sudden movement. The air was thick with tension, the weight of every word hanging heavily in the silence that followed. "I don't need to reflect," Mark said, his voice sharp. "What I need is for you to stop trying to pull the rug out from under me. I've worked here for years. I've earned my place. And I'm not going to sit here and let you take that away." Alex's smirk faltered, just for a moment, but it was enough to give Mark the confidence to continue. The room was still, every set of eyes fixed on him. "I don't care what kind of game you've been playing, Alex," Mark said, his voice growing louder, more forceful. "You're not going to strip me of my career without a fight." He turned to the rest of the room, the board members who had been so silent until now. "You all know this isn't just about a restructure. This is about power. This is about you trying to take everything from me. And you think I'll just roll over and accept it. But I won't. Not this time." The board members shifted in their seats, their discomfort palpable. Mark could see it now, the uncertainty in their eyes, the realization that they had underestimated him. Mark's eyes flicked back to Alex, who was now visibly angry, his jaw clenched in frustration. But he wasn't backing down. Not yet. Not until he knew the full truth. "I know what you've been doing, Alex," Mark said, his voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. "I know about the meetings you've been holding with the board behind closed doors. I know you've been plotting this for months, trying to push me out. But you're forgetting one thing." Alex's face tightened, his eyes narrowing. "And what's that?" Mark leaned forward, his gaze locking with Alex's. "I've been watching you, and now I have the leverage to stop you." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The tension was so thick it felt like the room was holding its breath. Mark could feel the weight of the moment. This was the point of no return. He had just thrown down the gauntlet. Alex stared at him, his hands clenched into fists on the table. Mark could almost see the gears turning in his mind as he processed the challenge. He wasn't expecting Mark to fight back this hard. "You think you have leverage?" Alex said, his voice low, a warning. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. You're out of your depth, Mark. This isn't a game anymore." Mark didn't flinch. "Maybe it's not," he said coldly, "but I'm not backing down. Not now. Not ever." The room was dead silent as the tension reached its breaking point. Every board member was watching, waiting to see how this would play out. Mark could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, a sense of determination surging within him. This wasn't just about business anymore. It was about everything he had worked for, everything he had fought to build. And he wasn't going to let anyone, tear it all down. But just as the standoff seemed to be reaching its breaking point, there was a sound from the doorway. A voice, calm and controlled, interrupted the tense silence. "Actually, there's something you both need to hear." Mark's head snapped toward the door, his heart skipping a beat. A new figure stepped into the room, someone Mark hadn't expected to see. It was the CEO, the very person who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes, the person who held the ultimate power. And in that moment, Mark realized that this confrontation was only the beginning. The game had just changed. The CEO's presence seemed to suck the air from the room. Mark's pulse quickened as he tried to steady himself, the weight of the situation hitting him all at once. This wasn't just a standoff between him and Alex anymore. It was bigger, more dangerous, and the stakes had just skyrocketed. The CEO, David Ellison, was a towering figure in the corporate world. His reputation was built on cold efficiency and calculated power. Mark had heard rumors about his cutthroat methods, how he'd built this empire by leaving a trail of broken competitors in his wake. But to see him in person, to feel the force of his gaze locking on him, was something else entirely. Ellison walked into the room slowly, his black leather shoes clicking sharply on the floor. The tension in the air was so thick it felt suffocating. Every word, every breath felt like it could trigger an explosion. Alex stood up, his expression shifting from one of confidence to uncertainty. For the first time, Mark saw a crack in the armor. Ellison was not a man anyone could easily manipulate, and even Alex seemed to recognize that. "You've all been waiting for this." Ellison's voice was low, but it had an undeniable power behind it. "The decision is final. Mark, Alex, I've been watching you both very closely." Mark's chest tightened. He felt the sharp sting of suspicion rise in his gut, his mind racing with 1,000 possibilities. Was this all a game? Was Ellison somehow pulling the strings behind the scenes? Ellison didn't wait for a response. He turned his gaze to Alex, whose lips had gone thin, and for the first time, Mark saw something close to fear flicker in Alex's eyes. "Alex," Ellison said, almost casually, "you've been running this little show for long enough. It's time for a new direction." Alex froze, his face draining of color. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice low but laced with panic. "You can't." "Enough," Ellison interrupted. "I've had enough of your games, Alex. You thought you could control everything, but the truth is, I've been pulling the strings all along." The room fell completely silent. Mark felt a chill run through him, as if the floor beneath him had suddenly turned to ice. The realization hit him hard. He'd been played. But worse, he was being thrown into a situation even darker than he'd imagined. Mark stood there, trying to process the whirlwind of revelations. His heart pounded in his chest as his thoughts scrambled to catch up with the situation. If Ellison was pulling the strings, then what role had he been playing in this? Was he just another pawn? Ellison turned his eyes to Mark, and for a moment, there was an unsettling stillness between them. "I know what you've been up to," he said, his voice no longer smooth, but cold, almost predatory. "You think you're some kind of threat to me. You're not. You're just a stepping stone, a cog in the machine I've built." The words hit Mark like a punch to the gut, and his jaw tightened. He could feel his blood beginning to boil, but he fought to keep his composure. He couldn't afford to break now. "Do you think I don't see what's happening here?" Ellison continued, a cruel smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You've been nothing but a distraction, Mark. A useful one, perhaps. But in the end, you're just another obstacle that needs to be removed." Mark's hands balled into fists, his mind racing. This wasn't just about Alex anymore. This was about a system that saw people like him, like everyone in this room, as nothing more than tools to be used and discarded. And that system had just revealed its full face. "What do you want from me?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper, the weight of the question hanging in the air. Ellison's smile widened, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was predatory. "I want you to understand your place, Mark. You're not in control. You never were." The finality in his tone was enough to make Mark's blood run cold. But before Mark could respond, before he could process everything that had been thrown at him in a matter of minutes, The door to the conference room slammed open. A sharp, high-pitched voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Enough, David." The entire room whipped around, and Mark felt the shock of seeing the figure standing in the doorway hit him like a freight train. It was Jacob, the youngest member of the board. He had always been the quiet one, the one who kept to himself in the shadows. But now, there he was, standing tall and firm, his eyes blazing with a quiet fury that sent a chill down Mark's spine. Jacob stepped into the room, his gaze fixed on Ellison. "You don't get to decide this for everyone," Jacob said, his voice calm but full of authority. "You've made your play, David. But I'm not going to let you destroy everything for your own gain." Mark couldn't believe it. Jacob? The quiet, reserved board member? He was taking a stand against Ellison, the very man who had orchestrated everything that was happening in this room. Ellison's face twisted with rage, and for a split second, Mark thought he might lash out. But instead, Ellison's lips curled into a sinister grin. "You're playing a dangerous game, Jacob," he said, his voice dripping with menace. "And you won't be able to stop what's coming." Jacob didn't flinch. "We'll see about that." The atmosphere in the room shifted. Suddenly, the stakes had been raised to an entirely new level. Mark realized that whatever was about to unfold, it was going to change everything. The battle wasn't just between him and Alex anymore. It was about something far larger than either of them. Ellison's empire was being threatened, and it was no longer a question of who was right or wrong. It was a fight for survival. And Mark had just become a player in a game that he couldn't afford to lose. Mark stood frozen, his breath coming in shallow gasps as the reality of Jacob's intervention washed over him. For a moment, the world seemed suspended in time. His heart raced, adrenaline still pumping through his veins, but there was a shift in the room, an undeniable tension that seemed to hum in the air. Ellison's fury was palpable, but there was a coldness to it now, something calculating, as if the wheels were already turning in his mind. Mark couldn't look away from the CEO, who was now facing off with Jacob, the young board member who had just become his enemy. Alex, who had been so confident just moments ago, was standing in stunned silence, unsure of where to place his loyalties now. "I don't care what you think, Jacob," Ellison finally spat, his voice a venomous hiss. "You've just made a huge mistake. You don't understand what's at stake." Jacob's jaw tightened, his posture unflinching. "Maybe I understand it better than you think," he shot back, his eyes burning with quiet intensity. "This company was built on power, but it doesn't mean we have to sacrifice everything for it." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Mark could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, the weight of the situation pushing down on him. This wasn't just about corporate maneuvering anymore. It was about survival, personal, professional, moral. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of footsteps as people shifted, trying to gauge their next move. Mark glanced at Alex, whose expression had hardened into something darker. The camaraderie between them had disappeared. The trust, built on years of silent alliances and corporate survival, was gone. Ellison's eyes flicked between Jacob and Mark, the realization settling in that his control over the room was slipping. He gave one last, cold smile before turning sharply on his heel, the click of his shoes punctuating the finality of his exit. Mark let out a slow breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The room was still, but the dynamics had shifted. The once powerful force of Ellison had been met with resistance, something he hadn't expected, not from Jacob, not from anyone in this room. "I wasn't expecting that," Alex muttered, his voice tight, his eyes avoiding Mark's. "You don't have to," Mark replied, his words sharper than he intended. The tension between them had snapped, but the damage was done. The trust they had once shared was irrevocably fractured. As the room began to empty, the weight of the finality of the situation settled over Mark. Alex left without another word, retreating into the shadows of the office building, and Mark was left to process the chaos of the last few hours. Jacob walked over to Mark, his expression thoughtful, but there was no warmth in it. "I'm sorry about the way things went down," Jacob said quietly, his eyes scanning the room, as though seeking to pull the pieces together. "But it had to happen." Mark nodded slowly, his mind still swirling with the fallout of everything that had happened. I'm not sure I understand yet, he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. But I know it's not over. This isn't the end. Jacob raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. No, it's just the beginning. As the days passed, Mark began to sense the depth of his transformation. The man he had been, eager to climb, eager to be part of a world that seemed larger than life, was slipping away. In his place, someone else was emerging. Someone who wasn't going to play by the rules anymore, who wasn't going to be pushed around by people like Ellison or Alex. It wasn't a victory. There was no celebration. But Mark understood that power was no longer what he craved. Understanding the systems that controlled his life and finding a way to shift them was where his true growth lay. Mark had come to realize that people like Ellison only won if you allowed them to define the rules of the game. But that game had changed. It was no longer about just surviving. It was about reshaping everything that had brought him to this point. Mark stood alone in the conference room, the skyline outside casting long shadows across the floor. The office building was eerily quiet, and as he looked out over the city, a faint smile touched his lips. It was a smile not of relief, but of determination, of something larger stirring within him. He glanced down at the paperwork scattered across the table, the path ahead still uncertain, but clearer now. He wasn't going to be a pawn in this game anymore. Not with Ellison, not with anyone. The power to shape his destiny was finally in his hands. As Mark stepped away from the table and walked toward the door, the faint sound of his footsteps echoed in the emptiness. It was the sound of a new beginning, one where the rules were his to make. And with that, Mark knew this battle was far from over. But he was ready for whatever came next. Like and subscribe for more interesting videos.